Billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome, everybody, to yet another very exciting episode of the Jamali Bridge podcast. The purpose of our podcast is, of course, to not only help non-Muslims living in the West understand Muslims better, to bridge gaps between them, but also to help Muslims understand their own beautiful tradition of Islam better. Our guest speaker today is Daisy Khan. I am so excited to have her be our guest today. Chris and I are going to talk about many things with Daisy. I am personally so excited because I was introduced to Daisy Khan through a documentary almost 20 years ago. And I remember watching Daisy on the screen and thinking, wow, she's an inspiration. She's amazing. And this is a time where I was not used to seeing Muslim women having a voice with passion and courage, uh, standing against the accepted narrative, even within the Islamic world at that time. So I was inspired at that age, at that time, even when Daisy actually didn't even know that I existed, but she served as a role model for me. And today, after so many years, after almost 2 decades, I am I'm following in her footsteps and doing what she has been doing for almost 25 years. So Daisy is an advocate for women's rights. She is also an author of 3 books. Her first book was Born with Wings. Her second book, Wise Up, is kind of like a manual for non-Muslims that want to understand Muslims better. And then her third book, which I'm super excited, is 30 Rights of Muslim Women, a Trusted Guide. It is like a Bible, a go-to for Muslim women who really want to understand what the Quran actually says about women's rights. And for non-Muslims also, if you think that Muslim women are oppressed in Islam, well, first of all, Daisy's going to change your mind about that. But then also you can read her book to understand better that Islam is egalitarian and actually women enjoy a kind of a special place of privilege in Islam. So I am super excited to invite our wonderful guest, Daisy Khan, with us today. Assalamu alaikum, Daisy. Welcome.
Walaikum salam, Eram. Thank you so much. I'm like, with all this praise, I have to like humble myself in front of God. So thank you so much. I'm so glad that you got inspired by that documentary. And but it wasn't me. It was the directors who directed it. The idea came from them, and I was just fortunate to be in that place at that time. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I not only
So,
enjoyed it, Daisy, I just want to add one thing here, Chris, because we will talk about this a little later in the podcast. My viewers know that my journey of Islam did include a phase where I hated God and I hated Islam. I hated Allah. And when I watched that documentary, which was produced by Michael Wolff and Alex Cronemer, they've produced beautiful documentaries, which was about Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. I was actually on a very critical juncture at that time, finding my way back to Islam. And I had always loved Prophet Muhammad, of course. And the documentary was very poignant for me, because I was at that stage where I was trying to pivot back. So seeing you and all the beautiful truth that was shared in that documentary was very important to me. And Chris, I will let you speak now. I've been talking.
no, thank you, Eram. I just wanted to say how privileged and fortunate I feel to be able to participate in this. I'm really grateful, Eram, that you've invited me to co-host these podcasts with you, and to meet you, Daisy. I feel like it's a great honor. One of the biggest reasons, and as we get into this interview, I hope we'll go deeply into this. One of the biggest reasons that I'm excited about having these conversations is because as a non-Muslim, I deal a lot with non-Muslims, and most of them don't have a clue about what Islam is or what does it mean to be a Muslim. There's over 2 billion of them in the world, more than a quarter of the world's population, and yet most non-Muslims don't really have a clue of what Islam really is, and the things they do know are complete misconceptions and incorrect understandings based upon media and all sorts of other things, right? So to me, this kind of conversation is really important, and I know that you have worked for years in what has been called this kind of interfaith dialogue. for me, it's Muslim, non-Muslim dialogue as well. You know, that whether you're a religious person or not, we should be having these dialogues. But I would love it if you would begin by sharing a bit of your story, because I know before we started, you said that your journey was going from lost to found, and would you describe a little bit about what that has looked like for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about, you know, how we come to do the work that we're doing today, some of us who are involved in social justice work or changing the world or bringing some wisdom to the world, you always have to go back to the roots of who we are and our own personal experiences. So my early childhood experiences were very positive because I was born a Muslim, but I was sent to a Christian missionary school where I had to do the Lord's Prayer every morning for 11 years
Wow.
of my life, from kindergarten to 10th grade. And, you know, I must have done the Lord's Prayer at least 3,000 times in my life. You know, we studied moral science, but at home we were Muslim. We, you know, it was a proper Muslim home, devout people, people prayed, we fasted, we gave charity, we did all the things. So having these two kind of coexist with one another, and then having teachers who were Hindu, who you revered, and they were your teachers, and then playing with Sikh girls and, you know, climbing mountains with them, and then buying freshwater pearls from Buddhists. I mean, the direct interaction with every great world religion, and then having this legend behind you that we were somehow from the lost 10 tribe of Israel. So there was even a Jewish connection, even though I'd never met a Jewish person. So I had experienced pretty much every world religion, you know, with the exception of Judaism, up until I was 15 years old. And so there was a celebration of our cultures. So getting to know one another, like this verse of the Quran that says, I've created your nations and tribes so you may get to know one another. So interfaith was part of part of my growing up experience. And then seeing the harmony and the coexistence between people and how that results into harmony and coexistence and peace. And we were living in a conflict zone. So imagine now when there's a breakdown of these relationships, how conflict, you know, comes about, and how you can then distrust the other group and so on and so forth. So we can see the opposite of that. But my early
You grew up in
experience,
Kashmir, is that correct?
I grew up in Kashmir, and then I came to America, and then there were these moments in America that we witnessed the Iranian Revolution. We witnessed the burning, you know, the fatwas of Salman Rushdie. And I was a young, aspiring career woman at this time, and I was very much into the literary circles, and I couldn't deal with books being banned and burned and people who profess to be part of my faith calling for that. It's just something that didn't sit well with me. And then I couldn't see the images and that I was seeing from Iran during the revolution. I couldn't reconcile with those because I had grown up in a very peaceful environment, you know, peaceful Islamic environment. And because I had no guides, I had no mentors because I was one of those lonely Muslims. I didn't know who to turn to. There was nobody to guide me through this conflict. And I was a young person who was so fragmented. I was like Humpty Dumpty falling apart, you know, so fragmented there was nobody to put the pieces together. So it was very difficult for me. And I just decided that I had to either be American or I had to be Muslim, because the Muslim part of me just didn't know how to reconcile with all this stuff. So I walked away from everything Islamic. And I remember telling my mother that I don't believe in Islam anymore. I never said I don't believe in God, because God was very much part of my inner, you know, compass. I just said I don't believe in this organized religion business, you know, the stuff that all the literary circles used to say, the religion is the opiate of the masses. So I thought, oh yeah, religion
Right.
is the opiate of the masses, because I'm seeing a lot of masses out there. So so it is the opiate of the masses, and I don't want to be part of that, you know. So my mother just looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, just because you've forgotten God doesn't mean that God has forgotten you. and I pray for the day when you find God. And that really stayed with me, that sentiment. And it was coming from such a trusted source that's when my journey to looking for God began. And I was living in Gotham, Manhattan, which is pretty godless place, there was, and Gotham, there was no God anywhere to be found. So I was just pounding the streets and looking for God in all the places, just like you would look for a man in all the bars and everything. And I went to every place of worship. I even went to ashrams. I went to temples. I went to a mosque, and I didn't realize at the time when I was going through this journey that I was actually going through what Rumi had gone through. And then I found the poem from Rumi. I was looking for God, and I went to, the temple and didn't find him there. And it's, of course, it's a very long poem. And then Rumi says, then I went to a synagogue and didn't find him there. I went to the hills of Kandahar, didn't find him there. And then, of course, in conclusion, I went to a mosque and didn't find him there. And then I looked in my heart, and there he was all along.
I like that very well.
So beautiful.
It ended, the journey kind of ended and began, because now I realized that God was inside me, in my inner core, and I was just looking out there. And then I remember a moment when I was a young girl. I had asked my grandfather this question: what is God and where is God? You always ask this question and you don't know where it's coming from. And he was gardening, because he was an avid gardener, and he was cutting his roses, and he just looked at me and he said, God is here. So he showed me a leaf, and God is in the rose, and God is here, and God is in the sky, God is in everything. Basically everything living being is God. And then he looked at me and he pointed his finger to my this thing. He said, God is right here in your jugular vein. And that's when I connected the two, because what Rumi said and what my grandfather had said about God being right inside. So then I realized later on that there was a verse saying that, that God is as close to my jugular vein. So it all came together, and it was beautiful, because from there on, I was on my own journey. I was now looking for God, and willingly, knowingly, and because my inner was all, so anyway, that's where the journey really begins.
Really a beautiful story. And it has led you to a lot more than just discovering God in your heart. You've taken God very much out into the world. Will you talk a little bit about how that transition happened and how you came to be doing the amazing work that you're doing today?
Yeah, first of all, I was paying, I didn't realize this, but I got myself, involved in a beautiful spiritual group, which was led by a convert sheikh who was, he was an amazing, his name was Lex Hickson. And I studied under his guidance. And I remember I used to come with hundreds of questions, like Eram mentioned, all these angry questions. Why this and why that? And I was like the most outspoken person. Everybody else in the group was like very humble. And I was always asking questions about why this and why that. And then he would just point me to the Quran. He said, have you read the Quran? And so I was always forced to go back and read, because he was always tell me, go read, find out for yourself. So he encouraged me to do that. And I remember reading a reading in the Quran that we are created as God's Khalifa, or human beings have been entrusted with this trust that God has given us to play this ambassadorial role, or be a steward of God on earth. And this is a charge that God has given to every human being, not just Muslims. It's all of creation. We assume the trust. We humans assume the trust, whereas everybody else rejected it because they were so afraid of this trust. But we assumed it. And when I realized who I was, that I wasn't just Daisy Khan, that I was entrusted with a role to play. My whole orientation changed. It reoriented my life. And I realized that I'm now a channel for I need to do something great with this charge that I've been given. So I had no idea what this was going to result in, but it changed my orientation towards who I was as a human being. So before, my identity was, I'm a career woman, I'm a this, I'm a this. So I have all these layers of identities that are nested into one another, because there's so many, when you are an immigrant, you come from other countries, you're this, you're that, you have national identity, you have religious identity, but my core identity was that I'm a breath of the divine, and my highest identity was I'm charged with the divine, by the divine, to do something with my life. And this is what this purpose-filled life is all about. Chris, you know that you've written a book on this topic. So so I was like, okay, just give me the charge. What do you want me to do? So I kept myself open. And I said, if you want to charge me with anything, just give me a charge. And so I have always remained open to that charge. And so every time I do an initiative, I think this is something that I've been charged with because this is my responsibility. I need to do this because maybe somebody else can't.
So
Well, I
beautiful.
know, and Eram, please jump in if you want. I'll just keep asking questions if you let me. But
Well, I
I was
was
just
going to
curious.
say one
Go ahead,
thing.
Eram,
I was just going to say
please.
one thing, Daisy, that, when I first met Chris many, many years ago, and he was my mentor for 10 years. So you could say that he was my sheikh. And I had all these questions that, like what you're talking about, I didn't have the good fortune of knowing many of these progressive scholars that we now have. And I would study the Quran with Chris, actually. And because many times I said, Chris, you don't know it, but you're actually a Muslim because you believe in all the things that we're supposed to believe in, and the ethics and the moral and the character, and you have such a beautiful relationship with God, which I didn't have at that time. And I would say, there's so many contradictions in the Quran, and I don't understand, because I was stuck on the subject of love. If God is so loving, why is he so hateful? And he's always angry, and he's always telling us we're going to go to hell. And then Chris would read the translation with me and help me understand how maybe the interpretation of what I was understanding was a little bit out of alignment, that God doesn't judge, God doesn't punish. You just create separation between yourself and God, and then you cause suffering to yourself. So it was so interesting that, you're talking about your journey, and my journey had a big thank you to Chris, who because he understood the universal principles of truth, it was so obvious. He was helping me to understand Quran and helping me to actually go deeper in the understanding of my tradition of Islam. Stay true to Islam. He always encouraged me to stay true to your tradition, to your faith. And ultimately, it also culminated in me finding God and realizing that he was always there. But so I just wanted to make that comment, that I find it so intriguing. We're talking about this, and then, Chris being here, who is non-Muslim, but pretty much saying the same stuff.
So I'm just going
With
to add,
the
I'm just
yeah.
going to add to that because this is very important. God doesn't always speak to us, through our, it's like you have to be really tapped in to have like direct inspiration from God, right? So oftentimes God speaks to us through other people. So and those other people can be anybody. It can be any incident, it can be any moment, it can be anything. And in my case, right after 9/11, I landed in a church to speak to a group of people, and mostly senior citizens. And there was a little old lady, and she asked me the question about women in Islam. And I rattled off all the rights that women had received in the 7th century proudly. I said women have the right to property, to inheritance, the right to divorce, the all the rights that we Western women didn't even have until recently. And she looked at me and she said, "I believe you, dear, but can you explain what is going on in Afghanistan? Because that's what people were seeing on television." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And of course, I was very angry at my inability to do anything for the women of Afghanistan because I was living in America. Now I had done some study of my religion, and I knew that Islam gave women full agency. But I was angry. Like, what am I doing? And then she just looked at me and she said, never mind, dear, because I kind of froze. I didn't have an answer. And then she said, I just want to know what you're doing about it. And
Wow, beautiful.
Chris, that question just penetrated to the level of my core. And I used to play that question in my head every time I would drive to work in the morning. It was a 45-minute drive because I was working for corporate America with a huge job, with huge responsibility. At 7 a.m., I had to be in the office. It was a crazy job, but paid me a lot of money. And I would drive and I would say, corporate America doesn't need me. My community needs me. Corporate America can replace me in 2 seconds. But my community needs me because I knew I had certain skills. And I just went to my, husband at the time, and I said to him, I said, I want to quit. I want to work for the community. But I was afraid to give up my job because my mother had always told me to stand on my own feet. I was sent to America to stand on my own feet. I had to be financially independent. And that's what my whole makeup was all about. Even when I got married and I said, I'm keeping my career, I'm giving up my career. And I said, well, will you be able to support me? And he looked at me and he said, if you're doing God's work, God will provide. That was it. I quit my career. I've never looked back, Chris and Eram.
No, I think you accepted your new career.
I accepted a new career, and money comes from here, there. Of course, it's not the same level. I don't spend on certain things anymore. But I'm just saying, when you're doing God's work, God does provide, So I quit, and that's how I got started. So I was just trying to echo what Eram was saying, that God does speak to us through other people. And this little old lady, I have never forgotten her.
It's a great, wonderful story. It always reminds me what it seems to me, not just in Islam, but in almost all religions, most religions, that there seems to be a common understanding that God is omnipresent. And yet it also seems that most of the time, anyone talking about God tends to forget that God is omnipresent, right? What you're basically saying is we can hear from anyone. We can hear truth from anyone. Of course, that makes complete sense when you understand that God is always speaking to us at every moment, because God is always present everywhere in our lives. But as long as we think God is somewhere over there, out there, and we're over here and we're whatever we are, poor, miserable creatures that we are, then we always create what Eram was saying. We create this separation, which in turn creates suffering. The only suffering, in my experience, and I'd love your comment on it, Daisy, but in my experience, the only suffering that any of us ever experience is when we consciously or unconsciously separate ourselves from God. What's your experience?
Well, that's what the experience that I went through, that fragmentation that I was talking about. I had the career, I had the money, I was living in Manhattan. I was a successful woman, but I had a hole that was so big inside of me that was empty. I felt I was empty. Why did I have all the material comforts, and why do I feel so empty? So that's the suffering part, feeling that I'm suffering because I'm disconnected from my source. And that's what Rumi talks about when he says, when the reed got separated from its this thing. So yeah, when we separate from our source, that's where the suffering begins. It's like separating from your parents and having what they call these dysfunctional, families, and how much pain and suffering that brings to people when you have, bad relations with your closest, their family. So that also happens because God is our source. We came from God, we're going back to God.
To me, it almost seems like let me cut off my hand. Okay, let me cut off the other hand. Let me stab myself in the chest. It's like
exactly.
It's like
inflict some more pain.
Yeah, exactly. So this is. I think you and Eram have talked about this before, but as you have mentioned, there's a lot of misunderstanding in the West about the nature of Islam. Most non-Muslims, what they know is from the media, and the media absolutely does not give any kind of truthful or objective perspective on what Islam is or what it means to be a Muslim. Can you share with us some of what you consider to be, particularly for our non-Muslim listeners, I'd like to ask this, what do you consider to be some of the most beautiful parts of Islam that can inspire both Muslims and non-Muslims? I think these things are not talked about enough, in my opinion. So I'd love it if you could share some.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the things that that the media portrays. So the media portrays Muslims as somehow being linked to violence, or violence is normative part of Islam, right? That's like, linking Islam and terrorism. But we know that Islam is a religion of peace, and peace through submission to the divine will. That's where the peace comes from. Like my own personal experience being so conflicted and fragmented, and then finding God, and then finding peace in that, right? So finding peace in your inner self. So peace is very much part of the Islamic, and religion, but it's the foundation of Islam. And so that misunderstanding has to change, because we do have extremists and terrorists that resort to violence, yes, but that they now exist in almost all religions, and they weaponize religion for their own political gains and aims. But the truth is, majority of Muslims are living a peaceful life, submitting to the will of God. So that's one thing. The second thing, which is even...
Wait, before you go on, Daisy, may I just make a comment? Because Eram and I introduced Eram to a friend of mine who, you'd probably call him a fundamentalist Christian, but he's a really beautiful man. I've worked with him a lot. But one of the things that he said is that he didn't trust to be in the same room with a Muslim, because his understanding was that Muslims, we were told to kill any non-believer.
Yeah.
But that's part of that's part of what it means to be a Muslim. Can you speak to that and help dispel that kind of...
Yeah, so it's again, it's this concept of, we have to kill the infidel, and it's people just cherry picking certain verses of the Quran, which were sent in a particular context of, if somebody is fighting you, go fight them. It's okay for you to fight them. But this verse of the Quran came specifically to the Prophet at the time when there was war being waged on him. And he was given permission to go hunt down the enemies. But they were not Christian. They were people who were at that time non-believers. So now what people have done is they have somehow redefined who a non-believer is, and they have put together not only Christians, Jews, but fellow Muslims who are also non-believers. And that's what I address in my Wise Up book, of this notion of, defining, and this is only being done by extremists. So the problem you have, Chris, is that when the extremists get all the airtime, like 24/7, that they're getting all the airtime, and people like me and Eram are not getting the airtime. And so what is the public to do? The public's perception of Islam gets shaped by what they see and hear in the press. So of course, there is no justification, no verse in the Quran that says go kill the infidel. That just doesn't exist. And because if that was the case, there would be no marriage between Muslims and Christians. You wouldn't have this kind of coexistence that we saw in the Golden Age. You wouldn't have these moments of 800 years of coexistence. And you wouldn't have the Golden Age. You basically, it's I feel that it's a distortion of a particular verse that people have deliberately distorted for political aims. And that's a distinction that we have to make. And this is the work that I do. I go into these audiences and I speak to people and I explain to them that weaponization of religion is one of the most dangerous things that any religion can face. We're watching it right now in many parts of the world where people are weaponizing religion. I don't even have to name them. Every religion now has weaponized. Even the Buddhists, who we think of floating on a lotus flower, right? Like we think of them as always being peaceful and floating, literally. But even they resorted to violence, right? The Buddhist monks were behind that in Myanmar.
Yeah.
So I wrote that book specifically to show how religion gets weaponized and what is the foundational thinking of extremists and why you have to be very careful and reject that and go back to your scriptures and see the source of your scriptures. So
wonderful. So will you continue with some of the beautiful aspects of Islam that you could
yeah.
share with us?
So I mean, the other beautiful aspects of Islam that is that really needs to be brought to light is that diversity is part of the divine plan. We have been created deliberately by the divine, by God, in all shades and all colors, just like a beautiful garden of flowers, right? And when you see a beautiful garden variety of flowers, don't you like look at that and you see a daisy and a pansy and all these things? They're all flowers, but they're all different. And so that's what human beings are. Human beings were created in nations and tribes so you may get to know one another. I love this verse. And so I tell people that diversity is part of the divine plan. So today I'm speaking to a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion groups, because they're the ones who are struggling with this issue of Islamophobia, and this is in corporations. And I tell them, I said, you talk about DEI within a workplace. DEI is part of God's DNA. God has created us deliberately diverse. Why? God says, so you may get to know one another. If we were all the same, there would be no curiosity. There would be no need for us to say, who's this other person? How do they think? What do they look like? Why do they look different? So I think this is a very beautiful concept that really needs to be brought to light. Then, of course, there's concepts like charity that shows us communal responsibility. So, Muslims are fasting for an entire month to share their wealth with the poor and the needy. How beautiful is that? Now, that has really taken on in America, People have really become very appreciative of the fact that Muslims fast for an entire month and then they give so much charity during that month. And so much so that people are now integrating iftars into their interfaith plans or into their corporate settings. I've been to some iftars where they even bring Muslims to talk about the significance of fasting and communal responsibility. Then there is the pursuit of knowledge, the constant push for pursuit of knowledge. If you want to put that in today's context, everybody is looking for a coach, Chris. Everybody's looking for a coach.
That's true.
Everybody wants to take a course on something. So this pursuit of knowledge is for personal development, right? I am one of those consummate learners. I'm always learning new things. And I think that pursuit of knowledge is a beautiful thing, and go as far as China and pursue knowledge. And it's part of, God's mystery. There's all these things that we have to discover still, but how do you do that without pursuit of knowledge? And then finally, I think that prayer, which many people find very beautiful, and in today's days, everybody's got meditation rooms because people are so stressed out. They want to slow down. They want to center themselves. And so what is prayer about? It's about centering yourself, reorienting yourself, prioritizing your day and prioritizing God over everything else, or stopping 5 times a day and saying, I'm going back to my source and I'm asking for guidance and I'm asking for help. So these are some of the things that, that I bring into the consciousness of people that are beautiful elements of Islam that have not been highlighted.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have another question, but Eram, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to say really quickly, thank you, Daisy. That was really beautiful. And, many a times Chris and I have traveled, Daisy. Sometimes we've, gone to these beautiful places when part of his mentorship routine was that we would meet twice a year and a lot of times it used to be not in America, but somewhere else. And I would have his undivided attention and one-on-one coaching for like a week. And Chris has been a TM meditator for a practitioner for what, 40 years? Some crazy number of years, Chris. 40?
52 years.
52 years. So every day, twice a day, he does his meditation. And it was sometimes so beautiful, Daisy, that it would be time for either Zohar prayers or Asr prayers or Maghrib. And it would be time for Chris to do his meditation and time for me to go into prayer. And we would basically, we were both doing the same thing in our own way and being able to appreciate for that, you know, in that, in each other as well. So, Chris, I know, has always, and he would always comment without fail. He would always comment and afterwards just say, you know, I just want you to know I find this tradition so beautiful. You know, just stopping whatever you're doing, just disconnecting from the world and connecting with God. And I love the fact that it's 5 times a day, you know, and me with my ADD, it was like, okay, Chris, okay, whatever. But yeah, being able to appreciate the beauty of that, you know, irrespective of what tradition you're from.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is a beautiful tradition because how often, and you know, both of you have worked in very, you know, busy careers, as I have as well. And I mean, how easy is it to get lost in the worries and concerns of day-to-day life and forget all about God? You know, you just focused, right? Okay, I got to get this done. I got to get that done. Here's my to-do list with the 30 things I got to get done today. And this tradition of making specific times and making time for prayer, I think, is so valuable when the person who's coming to the prayer brings their heart with it, that it's not just a rote repetition of a set of words, but it's the way you described it, Daisy, where you're bringing yourself back into connection with your source, bringing yourself back to a remembering and a realization of what is responsible for every good that's in your life, right? And
yeah. Well,
please go ahead.
Yeah, and it also, you know, we're so much into nature now. People don't realize this about the Islamic prayer, is that it is completely connected to the cosmic clock. It's connected to the cosmic clock because you start at dawn, you know, the break of light, the very first break of light. The second prayer is when the sun is at its highest. Then the third one is when the sun is waning. Then the fourth one is when the sun is set. And the fifth one is when you hit twilight. It's completely connected to the cosmic clock. So if you are into the cosmos and you want to be connected to how, you know, the shift of the day, then you can also approach it that way. And it's not random. It's not just a random thing. It's actually connected to the higher source of the universe and the planets and the sun and the moon. So
fantastic. So you mentioned, Daisy, you mentioned this beautiful old, quote unquote, old lady who asked you, what about the women who are suffering in Afghanistan? You know, it was so much in the media in those days. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, why are there these kinds of things that happen in some Muslim countries, and what have you been doing in particular? You said, you know, she asked you, what are you doing? I have a feeling from all that I've heard, and the book that you most recently wrote, you're doing a lot to address these issues. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so, you know, I mean, again, this goes back to the childhood experience. A lot of things we get shaped by who we are, by what we experience as a child, good or bad, right? So I remember my earliest memory as a child was I was standing on the front lawn, on dewy grass. I remember that. I can feel that dew even today under my little feet. And my father is standing there dangling a pair of boxing gloves. Boxing gloves are as big as me, and he's just dangling them. That's the only image I have. And I remember pow, pow, pow. And years later, I asked my father if he had ever given me a pair of boxing gloves, and immediately answered yes. I said, why? He said, because you were the third of 3 daughters, and somebody had bullied you, and I want to teach you how to defend yourself. And if necessary, fight them back. Now, my dad had 3 daughters, and he was a very unusual father as a sportsman. And he used to, people used to taunt him for having daughters. And then he would just walk around and say, "Oh, she's my lucky charm." And why? Because I just got another promotion. So every time a daughter landed, he would get a promotion. So he saw this as a lucky charm. So, and then when I arrived, and he's like, "I don't have a boy, but I can treat her like, I mean, she's a girl, but I can treat her like a boy." So that's why he gave me a pair of boxing gloves. Now, why am I saying this about the boxing gloves? Because it was a metaphor. It was because my dad was showing me that he had confidence in me. And my dad was empowering me with something that it wasn't like a physical pair of boxing gloves. And years later, when I came in America, I immediately said, "Oh my God, I have to take my boxing gloves out." Because now I was in a fighting arena, right? And now I'm in a fighting arena. I have to fight the big fight, and I need the boxing gloves. So the boxing gloves have become a metaphor for the fights that I have to fight. And when Eram said that when she saw the documentary, and now she's doing the work. So Eram, this is an invisible pair of boxing gloves that I'm just handing over to you, my dear. And you're going to pass them on to somebody else, because one of your listeners is going to take to heart these conversations, and they're going to take the boxing gloves into their own arena. So when the issue of Muslim women came up, I knew this was going to be the biggest fight, because I am a woman and I have a responsibility, and it's a big fight. And I also knew the fight was going to be a real tough fight, right? Because I'm up against power, I'm up against misogyny, I'm up against patriarchy, I'm up against a lot of things that I cannot undo, because these are societal issues that are so ingrained in people's minds. And that's when I tried to figure out what I was going to do. And I had to study what I was going to do by myself. And I said, well, I'm going to go to Afghanistan. I'm going to do something. Well, what am I going to do? I'm just an architectural designer. Yeah, I'm married to an but I'm an architectural designer. What can I do? And that's when another voice came. And a woman I met, her name was Helen LaKelly Hunt. She had just written a book called Faith and Feminism. And she had described the early suffragette movement in America and how the suffragettes fought the big fight by using a faith-based argument. They said, if in America, we believe that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? So they were like, if that's the preamble of the United States, then why is it that women are denied the right to vote? And why is it that, Black men doesn't have the right to vote? Or why can't women own property? So they asked all these questions, and they argued using the faith. And I knew that that was my answer. And I was like, okay, now I know I have to create a faith-based movement. And that's when my deep study of my faith began, because now I was trying to uncover, what can I find from my faith to fight this big fight? I needed God on my side. I needed a huge power on my side, right? The highest authority. So that's when I created WISE, Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality. And I made sure I used the word spirituality and equality in it, because I wanted it to be sourced in something that was so deep and something that was so wise. And equality, because I wanted to show that Islam was egalitarian, because that's what I had learned. So I know many people came to me and said, don't call it Islamic. Don't put Islamic in it, because you will be rejected. I said, no, this is my tradition. This is where I come from. And the organization is called WISE, because it's called WISE Women. So we were coming from a place of wisdom. So, and I've been able to do a lot of work because my arguments are faith-based, because I speak to the deepest values of people. The framework is Islam, and it shows that Islam has never restricted women from interpreting or expressing their faith, or from taking a leadership role, or from being peacemakers. And so with that knowledge and with that historical basis, that we're going back to 7th century Arabia and seeing Prophet Muhammad as progressive as I consider my father, because Prophet Muhammad was engaging women during his time. He was always surrounded by women because his earliest followers were women. Many of his earliest followers were women, and he was always defending them. And Prophet Muhammad was a father of 4 daughters. His sons
Wow.
died. He was a father of only 4 daughters.
Yeah.
So he was so compassionate towards women and such a defender of women. And that's
such a believer in
the
women.
message I am trying to convey to men in my community. Have you ever studied the prophets and how he related with women? If you just do that, you will be seeing what you see today as progressive, what progressive thought is. It was very progressive for its time. And I felt very comfortable in 7th century Arabia. I was like, I could live there. I could be there because the milieu was so dynamic. Everybody was involved in spirituality. The verses were coming down. The prophet was sitting with people. He was explaining the verses to them. There were men and women and slave people. Everybody was sitting together. The noble people with the women. And that is early Islam, and how far along we've come and how far we've deviated from that. So we need to go back to that and learn from that history for us to move forward.
How do you think we can use that history to, I mean, we live in a world which is pretty seriously divided right now, even in countries like the United States, which is supposedly a quote unquote developed country. The division, the ideological divide is huge these days, to the extent that people do get violent, whether even without religion, they get violent with each other over political ambitions.
Yeah.
How did the prophet manage to create peace and harmony in a world that was also divided? And what can we learn from what he taught?
Well, the prophet always he was a great strategist. What people don't realize is that, yeah, he was a prophet, but he understood his enemy and he understood power. And when necessary, he decided that it was important to save his community, prevent bloodshed, and make peace. So he actually created this wonderful peace treaty for 10 years. Would they be a peace treaty, which allowed the prophet to galvanize his people because now there was peace. And during those 10 years, he was able to increase his followers and gain strength. And after gaining that strength, he was able to walk into Mecca peacefully. And at that point, the enemy had gotten so weak because they had gotten so strong on this side. So that's the lesson that we have to learn from the prophet of understanding your enemy and then strategizing whatever your war strategy is, understanding that you have to first study your enemy and know the power of your enemy so that you can fight the enemy in the right way. And he did that with every battle that he had, because he had lots of little wars, because he was always being fought, everything from digging trenches. He would always scout. He would send scouts out. He would do a lot of research on what was going on, and then accordingly. And he was a prophet. God could have helped him, but yet this is what we learn from the prophet, right? You can't just rely and say, inshallah, God will do this for me. No, inshallah is good because the prophet said, first tie your camel and then trust in God. So there's a wisdom in that. Tie your camel first, then trust in God. But today Muslims are just saying, well, I'm going to, inshallah, everything will happen. No, inshallah, nothing happens unless you make the effort to happen. Yes, ultimately God's will is going to, materialize. But if you don't make the effort, I remember hearing this funny things. This guy who's always praying to God, God, send me a lottery, and then God laughs and says, "That you idiot! The least you can do is buy the ticket." It's just so funny. That makes sense.
It is. It's really funny.
Can
And,
I
and
ask
there's the classic story of the helicopter, right?
Yeah.
The man who the floods are rising and rising, and the
Exactly.
boat comes to take him away, and he says, "No, no, no, God will save me." And he's up on the roof, and they bring a helicopter and put the ladder down. He said, "No, no, God will save me." Then he drowns, and he goes to heaven, and says, God, why didn't you save me? He said, well, I sent you a boat and a helicopter and all these other things. Oh, what do you expect of me anyway?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You have to make the effort. And that's why I tell people, I said, people say to me, well, what can I do? I'm powerless. I said, no. I said, there's a Buddhist saying that 1,000-mile journey begins with one step. I said, what steps have you taken? I said, today, Chris and Eram, there are a lot of people that want to change the world, right? They go about, I want to change the world. And I said, no, don't change the world, just change your world.
Yeah.
And your world is a big world. It's you. First, change you, because there's a verse in the Quran that says a condition of a people does not change unless they change what is in themselves. So change begins with you first. Find out who you are, because when you change, you emanate that new self to everybody. And then people get drawn to you. And then once you know who you are and what you're supposed to do, then you can say, what change can I make? Like today, you talked about women's rights, right? So I'm so confident because I wrote the book. I spent 4 years writing my book, 30 Rights of Muslim Women, because I wanted to give this treasured gift into the hands of all the women, because I know that women are struggling everywhere in the world and they don't know what their rights are and they don't know how to defend themselves. So this is like a hammer against injustice and a shield against oppression, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm giving this to you. You have all the evidence now. It took me 4 years to do this research. And when you have a tool like this in your hand, you feel confident, because now you can speak with confidence because you're speaking with that authority. Oh, the Quran says this. So you're not like, oh, it's my opinion. So with that, I went to Afghanistan right after the pullout of Afghanistan. And everybody in my family thought I was crazy, because it was a delegation of women that went. And we decided we were going to engage the Taliban directly, eyeball to eyeball.
Wow.
And who was doing that after the pullout, like August? We went in April after August. And when the Taliban saw us at the airport, they said, welcome, you're the first delegation from America that has come here. We were the first people. And there was no embassy, so we could have been picked up, thrown into jail, hijacked forever, and never see the. But we took a risk because we're like, okay, we are women who are committed. Our intention is good. We've not come here to settle any score. We're just here doing fact finding. And as a result of that, I was able to engage with the Taliban directly. And then I discovered that no one speaks to them from a religious framework. And every time I was quoting things from the Quran and saying something that the Prophet did or said, you could see the face would change. The faces would change. And when a Christian reverend spoke, because she was speaking from a Christian perspective, they would melt away because she said, I built a mosque that you guys burnt. And they said, you built a mosque? And then they knew that mosque because they had burnt that. And now, from the previous Taliban. And so they were like melting away. Then the Jewish woman was there and she said, I'm here to unfreeze the assets that America has frozen because I think it's wrong. They couldn't believe that, So we were speaking from the framework of faith. And the engagement was very different than when the Swiss delegation came with a box of chocolates and was telling them that you need to open up the schools. They were like, we don't want to hear from you, because the framework, they didn't use the hadith of the Prophet, or they didn't use, what does the Quran say? And then, Eram, I discovered while I was speaking to them that many of them actually speak Urdu.
Wow.
And when I flipped into Urdu, the whole dynamic changed, because now I was able to speak to them as a brother and a sister.
Yeah.
Aapko ye pata hai? Like things like that. The whole dynamic changed. So it's speaking to people at their level, not at your level, speaking down at people. So I've learned a lot about how how to engage with people, and that's why the knowledge is very important. And because now today in Afghanistan, I'm doing trainings with this book, and we are equipping everybody who is hearing all these false hadith against women on how to speak back, how to rebut. And so so I've given people talking points, what to say, how to respond to this. That's the level that it's at. But it would have never happened had I not made the effort to write the book.
Of
Beautiful.
course, of course. And thank you so much for doing that, Daisy, for all the work that you have been doing for me. It's for me. It affects me personally. It affects my daughters personally. So thank you so much for all the beautiful work that you are doing, not just for Muslim women, but for Muslims and for humanity in general. I was wondering, Daisy, when you were talking about your interaction with the Taliban and then the Swiss delegation, I usually say this to my Western friends who have really nothing but good intentions at heart and, feel bad seeing the oppression of Muslim women, and they want to figure out how to help them. And I usually begin with saying, the biggest mistake that you can make is to think that Muslim women who are oppressed need to be rescued from Islam, because nothing could be further from the truth. We love Islam. We do not want to be rescued from Islam. However, yes, there does need to be, we need to take some actions. We need to do some work to actually end the oppression of Muslim women. And, the best tool at the moment, and I would love your comment on this, the best tool at the moment is knowledge, is the truth, just sharing of the truth from Quran, from the Hadith, telling people, okay, this is not true. However, what I find, Daisy, is that the conditioning is so deep. The patriarchal conditioning is so deep. I expect men to retaliate against what I usually say, like there's this famous saying in India and Pakistan, Khamin majazi khuda hota hai, So what that means, Chris, is that the husband is a false god or a demigod for a woman, which is based on a false narration. And the whole, there's a whole thought process behind it. So I've done some talks on explaining this is a false hadith, it's disputed, and it's this, and how can anybody be, compared to God? That's one of our basic covenants in Islam, that we only believe in one God. But I see a lot of resistance, almost ferocious resistance from women. And I understand that it's because of the conditioning and the fear of losing an identity and all of those things. But on a very personal level, Daisy, it still hurts. I hurt for them and I hurt for myself also from time to time. And I'm very grateful for having wise guides like Chris in my life who help me to remember that, only I have the power to hurt myself and stuff. But on a pragmatic level, it still is painful to watch them fight so hard to stay in suffering. So what do you do? Do you ever feel down? Do you ever feel like, oh my God, this is so much? And then what do you do to get out of that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I mean, because I have been fortunate to be in a position where people come to me with these issues. So what I do is for every person that comes with an issue. So I remember once there was a call that I received in the office from a random person from Florida, a woman who said that her brother-in-law had pronounced triple talaq, 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 to his wife, meaning divorce, divorce, divorce. So, oh my God, she's divorced. And I said, wait a minute. She may be divorced in his head, but she's not divorced in America. I said, in America, we have laws. You have to go in front of the judge. Only then you are divorced. Until then, you're not divorced. So, and then she said, okay. So she came back the next day and she said, yes, but the imam in India, because he had gone back to India and he had said, oh, I'm not divorced. And the imam in India said, absolutely no way. Your wife is divorced from you. She has to get remarried, because he wanted to take his wife back. She has to get remarried. She has to consummate her marriage. Then she has to get divorced from this other man, and then you can marry her. Basically, this was a deterrent for a man not to do this. But so she's back to me, and I said, okay, let's discuss it another way. Let's try the legal route. I said, was your brother-in-law feeling angry? She said, oh yeah, he was very angry. I said, would you say he went temporarily insane? She said, absolutely. He was crazy. I said, so he uttered this when he was not in his normal state? Yes, he uttered this in his normal state. I said, then it is temporary insanity. which is grounds for, it violates everything else. So if you're doing something when you're not of your own, in your proper mind, then it's invalid. And so your sister is not divorced. And she said to me, she said, I trust you, but can a man deliver this news to me instead of you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had to find a man in my office who was a Christian man. I told him, I said, deliver the news to her. So and he knew a little Arabic because he was a student of gender studies and Arabic studies. So these are the kinds of things that I have seen in my community, because often people come to me with these kind of crazy ideas. And I saw this like manipulation of the faith, or not knowing what your faith is. And this is why I wrote the book. So I feel that now we have to really accelerate and educate as many people as we can. So I know you've created a podcast, which is a wonderful venue. So people have urged me to create a podcast around these 30 rights and to really disseminate
Brilliant.
this into the consciousness of people, because people are consuming knowledge differently now, and they are consuming it through social media. They're going to YouTube to look for this inspiration. So I also, must do this. And but to the point where you're talking about men thinking that they are somehow have the upper hand over women, this was addressed at the time of the prophet, when the prophet's wife, Salama, who was a very astute, politically astute woman, she had 5 children of her own. The prophet married her because her husband was martyred in one of the wars, and she was like his confidant, and she asked him, because women complained to her, and she was also wondering, she said, why does the Quran always address men only? Like all these revelations were coming to the men, because men are usually the troublemakers. And so this, and then the prophet didn't know what to say, because he didn't have an answer. He doesn't know why God is sending these revelations only. So then what happens is that within a short time, the most beautiful verse was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, introducing for the first time in all of human history a gender inclusive language. And that references women, that shows that women are co-stewards of men, surely for believing men and women, believing devout men and women, truthful men and women, patient men and women, humble men and women, charitable men and women, fasting men and women who guard their chastity, and men and women who remember God often. For all of them, God has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. I mean, this is divine dialogue. It's such a gift for women. They need to remember this verse 33, 35, like on the tip of their tongue. Every time somebody says that, go back to that verse and say, what does this mean? So this was a corrective from God to show that the man doesn't have an upper hand over woman. What we talk about equality, in terms of biology, that's a very different kind of thing. We're talking about spiritual equality, moral equality, which is far superior than anything else.
Wow, you just did it again, Daisy. We were talking about how God speaks to you through people sometimes. This is also one of my favorite verses, because when I was reading about the history of why it was, because it stands out, Chris. It stands out in the Quran, and like French, Arabic also has like male and female thing in the language. So I used to wonder, like, why this particular verse? He's just making sure it's believing men and women and the patience men and women, and then when I found out that it was because women had complained to the prophet, it was like, wow, look how interactive God was with women. So they complained to the prophet, and next thing you know, Revelation is in question to. So they had complained to the prophet, but God is answering them. It was so near and dear to my heart, validating the concerns of women and the complaints of women, that I am not just the Lord of men, I am the Lord of you also. And the love that God is showing, the care, this is, we're talking about the King of Kings, the ruler, the owner of the universe, and he's listening so intently and he's responding with compassion and mercy. And what you also did today, Daisy, because my question was more about how do I stay steadfast? How do I, when I get hurt, how do I overcome that? And you answered that through this verse, because the verse actually says that if you stay steadfast, I will have a great reward prepared for you. So he just spoke to me through you and answered me. Yeah, that is so beautiful.
You have to anchor yourself in something of such a high level and such a high authority. That's why I'm saying if people begin to think of them as stewards of God, and you imagine that you have been charged by the divine to go into this earth and to fulfill a purpose. So the whole questioning should be, what am I supposed to fulfill? Like I look at my mother, and she has raised the 5 most beautiful children. Her whole life is dedicated to raising. So if your purpose is to raise the most beautiful children, because that affects future generations, that's your purpose. If your purpose is to be a mother and a great scientist, like who is going to bring us the James Webb telescope, who happens to be an Indian woman, a chief scientist there, then you've accomplished your purpose. So find out, what is your purpose? What is your talent? Because everybody was given a little talent. We have a talent that God has given
beautiful.
us. So find that talent.
I have to make a comment here, because one of the, as I and my partner have dived into this whole issue of purpose, it became clear before long, and I think this is really one of the most beautiful, for me, one of the most beautiful expressions of God's wisdom in the way that he has designed this creation, is that our purpose is tied to what we love. It's tied to what we care about. When we get clear, we've seen this now with thousands of people, over 1 million people have taken our passion test around the world. Thousands and thousands of them have told us how they have gotten this renewed sense of purpose. We've seen that the fact is that when people discover what they love, what they care about, what brings them joy, what they're passionate about, that even if they can't articulate what their purpose is, they discover when they consistently choose in favor of those passions, they begin to feel life is purposeful. They begin to feel that it's meaningful. And this comes back to the point you were making, Daisy, is that, what, from my perspective, and I think you're just saying it in different words, that every single human being is born with a purpose. God gives each of us a purpose, a reason that we are here, that we're alive. And really, one of our major jobs in this life is to discover what that purpose is. The beauty of it is that when we follow the path that leads to increasing joy, now, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges along the way. I don't want to suggest that it's always easy, because it's not always easy. But when you feel passionate, when you feel that sense of purpose and meaning, then nothing can stop you. I'm sure you've had this experience yourself. I know Eram has, for sure, that challenges do come up, but obstacles come up. But when you feel that passion inside, that sense of purpose, as you described it, that mandate, then you find some way around it, or under it, or over it, or some other way, some way. There's that force within. And my experience, and I'd love your comment on this, is that the more you're aligned with that sense of purpose and aligned with the things that light you up, that you love, that you care about, that the things that really matter to you in your life, the more joy life has. There's more and more joy. And for me, and Eram, she's nodding her head because we've talked about this for years, is that this is the path to God. We think the path to God is if I do something wrong and get punished, but the punishment only, from my perspective, the punishment only comes when we ignore the guidance that God is always giving us. Yeah. When we follow that guidance, what we discover is that there's a path of increasing joy, and that increasing joy is leading us to the infinite joy, which is what God is. And I want to just put this in the context of women, because and I'm sure you're more aware of it than even that I am, but I remember being shocked by the statistics when I read that not just Muslim women, but 7 out of 10 women in the world will be physically or sexually abused in their life at some point. It just is a statement to the fact that the issue of the relationship between men and women is critical to the ability of our planet to survive. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what you feel is the role of Muslim women in this particular situation that is not just an issue of Islam, in my opinion. It's an issue of humanity. And
Yeah.
if you have any message that you would like to share for Muslim women in this context.
Yeah, well, so I think that when I go back to Muslim women, I go back to scriptures and again, looking at how God created the first human, and then that first human was Adam, a male, and unable to do anything. And so God had to create a spouse, a counterbalance, because what was a man going to do by himself? There was going to be no civilization. There was not going to be progeny. There was not going to be anything. There would be no society, no family, no nothing. So I tell people, look at the charge the women have been given. She's almost a co-creator. She's brings life in. God is the ultimate giver of life, but she ushers in life into this world that becomes the nucleus of a family, right? And women are the ones that hold the family together when everything else falls apart. It's women. In every war zone, there are all these statistics. That woman is the glue that holds the family together, the community together, the society together, and ultimately civilization. So when a woman comes apart, society comes apart. And this is what worries me about Afghanistan. They think that somehow by locking women in, that they are preserving women's dignity, but actually they are, preventing their country from developing, because you have, women are not given the agency that God has given them. So I think that women are very uniquely positioned to be peacemakers, and like I said, create this holistic environment. And this is why we see so many women today in the West, Muslim women, leading all kinds of efforts. Like they are really taking this charge upon themselves to lead in these turbulent times. I just heard from a doctor who had gone to Palestine, specifically to Gaza, and he was talking about all the things that he witnessed. But then he said there was one thing that he witnessed that was hopeful. And he said that there are 6 girls that pack their school bags every morning, dodge bullets, and they've made an alliance between them, that it doesn't matter if one of us gets shot or 2 of us get shot. Even if one of us survives, one of us is going to become a future doctor or somebody. And they have made a pact that they will not leave. That if every other man leaves, we will not leave, because as women, we want to build our place again. So he said, all the men I interviewed, they said, I can't wait to get out of here or go to another country. The women said, no, we're staying behind. So you see, at the end of the day, it's like I said, a woman is the glue that's holding the family together. And I think that many women are living at this crossroad of faith, identity, culture, especially in the United States, and they have valuable perspectives in bridging divides. I know personally, I've been a bridge builder all my life, right? I was able to cross the aisle and meet with interfaith allies, create all these wonderful initiatives that has secured all of us together, because we become allies of one another, and we're all people of different faiths, understanding that we have the same challenges, and that the challenges that we have endured historically are the same challenges that now another group is enduring. So we're learning from each other's experiences. And so I think that there's power in female leadership, especially in peace building. And this is not something that is not mentioned in the Quran. There's actually a story of Queen of Sheba in the Quran that specifically talks about how Queen of Sheba, confronted by Solomon, who is a prophet king, who challenges her because she's a pagan queen, but she has military might. She can defeat him, and but she does not choose war. because she chooses the welfare of her people, because she knows that when there's going to be war, quote unquote, according to the Quran, says when kings come into town, they destroy everything. She knows her place is going to get leveled. And so it's such a beautiful, elaborate story in the Quran. And Queen of Sheba, Bilqis in Arabic, that she is the archetype of a wise political leader. And she is juxtaposed against the Pharaoh as being tyrannical, who drove his people under the sea, and she saved her people. So here we have an example from the Quran itself about women's leadership. And then, this is why we've had more than 15 Muslim women leaders around the world, because each of them know their own history. And we've had women leaders historically, over the centuries. So yes, I think that women play a vital role, because women will address inequality. They will create deeper understanding between their communities, but also they challenge extremism, because peace, ultimately women want peace. And this is the one thing that the Taliban and women in Afghanistan have in common. They both want peace, which is that one place where they can have commonality.
Wow. Wow, that was so filled with wisdom. Oh my God. And I just realized that even for myself, because of the patriarchal explanations, this role of Queen of Sheba, the way you portrayed it, is so beautiful. And typically what we hear is that, yeah, there was this queen, and she had to lift her skirt because the the crystal under her feet was so beautiful that she thought it was water, and kind of showing her as naive. Yet here we are. You're absolutely right. There's so much wisdom in her approach, and she was totally a figure of leadership. Daisy, all the wonderful things you have shared, and I know I had promised Chris, because he's in India and it's really late for him, and you can see he's kind of, like a cat, he's falling asleep. So I just want to, I want to be mindful of that, and I want to ask you, if somebody watching and listening, somebody from the West resonates with what you're talking about, what can they do to help? What would you suggest?
I think that from my experience, allyship is very key, and getting to know your Muslim neighbor, or getting to know a Muslim. If you don't know a Muslim, get to know a Muslim. Your life will get so enriched, because not only will you be able to prevent the discrimination and the Islamophobia from spreading, but your life will be enriched because you will get to know somebody personally that have a personal experience with. So I tell people it's a simple thing: befriend a Muslim, just get to know them at a personal level. Have a meal with them and you will enjoy some great food. This is a guarantee. You will be treated to such hospitality. It doesn't matter what part of the world a Muslim comes from. They have an open door. They're extremely hospitable, and they are nice people. And you'll also find the commonalities that you have, right? If you haven't started a little group where you're doing book readings, if that's what you like, do a book reading. Create a dialogue group. There are many dialogue groups that people have, and you can even get involved in interfaith and cultural exchange programs that already exist. So if you can't create something on your own, you can actually be part of somebody else's. Seek out an iftar. I don't know a single iftar that they would not love a non-Muslim to come and be a guest with them.
Describe what an iftar is for those.
Iftar is a fast break during Ramadan, when we break our fast at sunset. Yeah, we break our fast at sunset. It's usually a communal feast or a communal meal. And many interfaith people come to those, and they see the ritual, and they see what Muslims do and how they pray, and the charity that people give. Simple acts of kindness are so important. And showing up, like right now, a lot of people are showing up in protests in support of, oppression. So there are many ways that people can get involved, and they just have to choose what works for them.
Beautiful.
I love this. I love the very simple, practical suggestion of make a point of making a friend who's a Muslim if you're a non-Muslim. And I hope it would also go the other way,
Yeah.
that
Oh, yeah.
Muslims would also make a point of making non-Muslim friends. I have to say that the friendship that Eram and I have enjoyed has enriched my life so profoundly. And I will be the first to admit that when we first started talking, I knew about that much about Islam,
Yeah.
very, very little. And now I feel now I may only know that much, but what I do know is that truth is embedded in the Quran. Truth is embedded in the teachings of Islam, and
Yeah.
that which appears not to be true is a distortion of the
Yeah.
truth of what Islam is. So
Yeah.
for that I'm deeply grateful.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris and Eram. Thank you for bringing me this conversation. This was absolutely lovely.
And we must do it
Thank
again because it really was. I know for the Jamali Bridge, we wanted to touch on certain subjects, but I could see before we started the call when it was just you and Chris talking, and I was just listening like, wow, this is amazing. Just talking about the more, spiritual aspects of all the traditions, talking about Rumi and talking about all of those things. I think that too would be such a beautiful conversation between you and Chris, which I would love to be a witness to. And I also wanted to mention, which Chris is too humble to ever remind people that he is the New York Times bestselling author of The Passion Test. So all those pearls of wisdom that Chris, you were sharing with us earlier about passion and the importance of having purpose and a passion-driven life can be found in that book, which was the book that served to change my life in a big way too, and introduced me to Chris Atwood for the first time. And I have been a fan ever since. So I encourage people to find that on Amazon, and of course Daisy's books are also on Amazon. So thank you so much, both of you, Chris and Daisy, and especially Daisy. It was so wonderful to connect today and to talk about these wonderful things. Again, thank you so much for everything that you are doing in the world.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I second that as well. Daisy, I really have to say is that, that to me, I remember when I was in college, I went to University of California in Santa Barbara, which is sort of this beautiful place, but it was the height of the Vietnam War, and so there were riots and protests and all sorts of things going on at that time. And I remember that I had such great respect for those who really stood up for what was right and true. And that's when I got my first inspiration of, well, we not only can, but we need to make this world the heaven it was meant to be. And I just want to salute you as being one of those people who is helping to make this world the heaven that I know that God always has wanted it to be. So really thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all that you're doing.
Thank you so much. And none of this would have happened without, God's grace. And I think that I feel fortunate to be put in this position. But I want people to know that each and every one of you can also step up and assume more than you think. Because when you're doing God's work, it's almost effortless. It feels effortless because there is a bigger hand behind you that's pushing you, that's navigating you, because you're on a much bigger path. And it's almost like, walking in the footsteps of the prophet, in the sense that, you're a messenger of the messenger of the messenger. So that's why I love getting to know the prophet's life more, because the more I see how he behaved, the more I can behave that way. And I can impart that same wisdom onto others. And I think that it's really important to study that and model yourself after that. And Chris, that's why people like reading books like yours, is because they want guidance on how to do this, right? So yeah, so if you want to go back to your own source, you want to go back to how the prophet did all this, then study his life, and people don't study this, they need to start studying the prophet's life and who he was, and a lot of this misconception will just like shatter away.
Beautiful.
Okay.
perfect ending to a great conversation filled with wisdom. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll be getting together again soon.
Okay,
Bye-bye,
thank
guys.
you. Bye-bye.